Hey everyone, just to let you know that this is, well, obviously part 2 of our, what was originally one long part of a George Elliott Clarke interview. I hope you appreciated part 1. Sorry for the delay about part 2. If you want the full episode in one fell swoop, consider supporting us on Patreon because I was able to put it all up there. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and yeah, we'll get right into it. It picks up exactly where the other one left off. Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
And just creating great inconveniences. We know right now because of a memoir that was published, memoir of Mum Sue's, which was published in 2010. She talks about growing up. She lived to be over 100 years old. She talks about visiting Halifax in the 1920s, 1930s, and seeing signs in the public gardens that said "No Negroes or dogs allowed."
So
Public
really
gardens,
making that parallel clear, right? Yeah.
yeah. So, okay, there's no Ku Klux Klan per se, but there's still the attitude. And even then, there was Klan. You know, the Klan was de facto shadow government of Saskatchewan in the 1920s. They tried to move into Ontario, but the Ontario government, the first socialist government of Ontario, United Farmers of Ontario, blocked them from coming into Ontario. And certainly they did burn crosses in New Brunswick and had field days and were walking around with the white sheets and the hoods. And in British Columbia, there were Klansmen who were proud to parade themselves around out there too. So it was here, but outside Saskatchewan, pretty much fairly limited. But the attitudes were there. And so to fast forward to what some of us might want to think of as being a civil rights movement, although I don't really like that term, because Canada is simply a different place than the United States. And so while practices can seem similar and are similar, there are social, economic, and political differences that make the experience itself different and make opposition to the experience of racism different in Canada as opposed to the United States. So one example of this is that while King in particular was able to marshal millions of people, especially in the South, to struggle for their civil rights, the right to vote and so on, especially the right to vote, in order to get rid of the machinery of oppression and Dixie and so on, Black Canadians already had a right to vote. We already had that. So there wasn't really a necessity for civil liberties here. We had freedom of speech. We had a right to vote. We had a right to assemble where we wanted to. That wasn't the issue. The issue was impingement on our dignity in terms of our human rights. Can we eat where we want to eat? Can we sleep where we would like to sleep? Can we work where we'd like to work? These were the issues that had to be confronted by Black people in Canada. But there were relatively few of us. Nevertheless, there were movements that developed led by a gentleman by the name of Hugh Burnett in southwestern Ontario to desegregate places like Chatham and Dresden around dining establishments, especially Amherstburg as well, Windsor, London. These were the places where there were basically, there wasn't necessarily you'd have signs up saying no Blacks allowed, no Negroes allowed, no coloreds allowed. It wasn't necessary. It would be known in the community that you
it was very implied. Yeah.
This was the Canadian way. This is the Canadian difference. Racism with a smile and a wink and a nod and a pat on the back. Right? No, so sorry, but yes, you can't play pool here. So sorry, but yes, you cannot eat here. Right?
Yep.
So
the dark side of sorry. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. But movements began in Ontario, led by Hugh Burnett, and then later on by the McCurdy's, George McCurdy, Howard McCurdy, through the 1950s, 1960s. In Nova Scotia, there was the Nova Scotia Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and important to that organization, people like Pearline Oliver, who was single-handedly responsible for opening up nursing for Black women in 1949, starting in Nova Scotia, but then expanding into Ontario and Quebec, which was extremely important because once Black women could become nurses, that meant they could now become middle class. Decolonizing your mind is knowing your history. Decolonizing your mind is knowing your history. As soon as Black women could become nurses and teachers, you have the beginning of a Black bourgeoisie in Canada.
Right.
Before that point, you can't. Everybody's got to be either clergyman or working class, period. That's it. There's nothing else you can do. Or leave, go to the States, go to Montreal, go to Toronto, and hope for a better life in one of these areas. But if you stayed in some places like Nova Scotia or even southwestern Ontario, unless you went to Detroit, again, your prospects are going to be very limited. So the Guardian Club in Windsor and Amherstburg, London, Chatham, Dresden begin to, in the 1950s, to take up the cry against segregation in schools, segregation in dining establishments, hotels, and so on. In Nova Scotia, again, it's Gus Wedderburn and Pearline Oliver, and then Rocky Jones in the 1960s, who begin to destroy the edifice of segregation, polite segregation in Nova Scotia. By 1954, Nova Scotia has outlawed segregated schools. By 1960, the same thing happens in Ontario. But again, those attitudes still remain. But the great difference between Canada and the United States is that there's no mass movement. There's no mass movement of blacks and whites, Jews, Catholics, Protestants together marching in the streets saying, let's get rid of segregation. Because of the fact that the governments, this is the Canadian difference. As soon as Canadian governments recognized that they were going to look bad in the eyes of the world if they allowed segregated establishments to continue to exist, they quietly got rid of them. Yeah. Quietly said, okay, that's now illegal.
As we tend to do here, just quietly shove it away.
Yeah, that's right. So that means there's no possibility for a mass mobilization as there was in the U.S. In the U.S., the Dixie governments all said, we're going to oppose you, King. We're going to stop you. Segregation now, segregation forever. But all that did was feed staunch opposition, right? March on Selma, blah, 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 right? Bombings here, lynchings there, et cetera, et cetera. A lot more violent, but also a lot more public, a lot more historic. Right. In Canada, the end of segregation is achieved relatively quietly. Few people go to prison. Almost nobody gets killed. And even if the racist attitudes are still there, the inconveniences are disappeared. Right? And so the literature then is going to be a literature that is going to reflect on what's going on in the U.S. decolonization in the Caribbean and in Africa, and protests against European imperialism, Western hegemony in former colonies, and so on. But for the most part, and here's the real Canadian difference when it comes to African-Canadian writing, Black Canadian writing, the real activism against segregation and racism, anti-Black racism in Canada was not movements to say we could have a beer where we want. Oh, I forgot, demon liquor, don't touch it.
Of course.
So no, don't go near it. And to be able to, get a room in a hotel where we want, and so on and so forth, and to go to school where we wanted. So all that was achieved relatively quietly, right? So what was the real movement to bring about anti-racism in a very pronounced way, and even semi-public way? And it was one word: immigration. The great civil rights movement in Canada was immigration. And it's interesting. It begins in the same year as the Montgomery bus boycott, which launches the civil rights movement in the U.S. begins. 1955. 1955, King leads the movement to desegregate busing in Montgomery, Alabama. And of course, that expands into the civil rights movement all over the U.S. In Canada, the government of Louis Saint Laurent brings in quietly, very quietly, the West Indian domestic scheme. And that scheme was classically Canadian. It was racist, sexist, and classist. All three in one policy.
That's efficiency for you. Yeah.
What that policy said was, if you were a Black male from the Caribbean, you were now allowed to come to Canada as a student, specifically as a student. The government would have known that any West Indian coming to Canada as a student would be coming from the West Indian middle class, upper class, to be able to enter Canada as a university student. So that's the classist aspect of it. And there's still a classist aspect of it in terms of Black women. Black women were invited to come to Canada from the Caribbean specifically as maids. Specifically as maids. So there's the other side of the classist coin. It's also sexist, of course. No matter how educated a Black woman might have been, coming from Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, etc., coming into Canada in the 1950s, they had to come as maids. So the great struggle, once immigration, especially from the Caribbean, began in Canada in the 1950s, was to, end discrimination discrimination, even the quiet discrimination in housing, in education, in dining establishments, and so on, all over the country, but especially in the major cities, which would have been Toronto, Montreal. Montreal would have been receiving immigrants coming from Haiti primarily at that point, especially after 1960. So it's the arriving immigrants, particularly from the Caribbean, who have not grown up with anti-Black racism. Yes, they've been oppressed by white British and white European control of their colonial homelands, absolutely, but they've not been directly oppressed by white police, white mayors, white bosses, because they're all Black and brown. Their bosses are Black and brown. Their teachers are Black and brown. So their first experiences of direct anti-Black racism is only when they step off the plane or the boat into and go to Toronto and go to Montreal, and all of a sudden they are told they are Black, which is a big shock to them because they've been Black all their lives. They never thought of it as being anything different.
Right.
They think of themselves as being British. They think of themselves as being French because that's the colonial attitude, right? So the first West Indian immigrants coming to Canada demand equality because they are British. They can't understand why anybody's calling them Black. They're British. They demand to be treated like any Briton with respect, for crying out loud, right? So when they begin to be told, no, you're Black or you're the N-word and we're going to treat you like this, they push back because they are coming with pride of being nationals. They come from a country. They come from a colony that's becoming independent, right? And so they don't need to take any second-class treatment from white Canadians who may actually have been, in some cases, poorer than them, less educated than them. How dare they attempt to oppress them and relegate them and segregate? So that was the real pressure for change in Canada, was through immigration. Thank you, Louis Saint-Laurent, in a backhanded compliment,
right,
as opposed to an actual kind of civil rights movement.
So that's, again, like as succinct, I guess, as we could get with a very broad question like that. Mac, did you want to go ahead? I think we'll kind of focus the rest of the questions here on how your work specifically engages with the history of African Canadians, right? Because I do feel like that does, not only in an academic sense, but in a poetic sense, that does exist. And go ahead, Mac.
Yeah, so we were just sort of curious if what kind of, if any, assumptions you had about Black lives in history within Canada, if you had any of these before you started writing your books, and then how you sort of learned and how these assumptions and ideas changed.
That's a great question once again, and I'll just say that I grew up knowing that I was partly African American, and my culture in Nova Scotia is partly African American. I'm also partly West Indian, and I'm also partly Indigenous.
Right.
And I call myself Afro-Métis because the Cherokee people were evacuated from Nova Scotia after the War of 1812 because they were allies of the British, and so I have a maternal connection to Cherokee people. Well, obviously my mother's side, Mi'kmaq. I also have a connection to Mi'kmaq on my father's side, but I can say for sure about the Cherokee connection, so I'll focus on that. But to come to the point, I grew up thinking of myself as being colored, as Negro. I was born in 1960, and then Black, and then Black American. I did not see any difference between myself and my people, Black Nova Scotians, and Black American.
Right.
We like the same singers, we like the same stuff, we like the same food. I didn't see any real difference between our groups until I became older, and also when I lived in the United States. I started teaching at Duke University in 1994, and strangely enough, when I arrived at Duke in 1994 to teach Canadian and African American literature, I was a fire-breathing Canadian nationalist, rabid Canadian nationalist. George Grant up the yin yang, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Lament for a nation, woohoo! Right, and actually opposed to the American Empire. Well, I'm still opposed to the American Empire, but even more so then, and trying to think that the way forward was for everybody to become red Tories.
Sure.
Grant makes a good case in Lament for a Nation and some of his other writings. But anyway, I also began to see subtle differences, which I've also touched on a bit before, but I'll come back to it now. And I'll use as my anecdote the Million Man March, which took place led by Louis Farrakhan, Nation of Islam, in October 1994. it was not October 1995, the weekend practically after O.J. Simpson was acquitted of murder, in that notorious trial, which lasted practically a year, from 94 to 95. Anyway, a lot of my black colleagues at Duke University called me up, said, "Are you getting on the bus? Are you coming to Washington, D.C. with us?" And that actually created a little political dilemma for me, because as much as I identify with African American, and I do identify with Black American, 100%, or maybe I'll say 99%, there's a part of me that is, and was even then, Canadian. And the Canadian part of me, the English Canadian part of me, is suspicious of mass movements. When you look at Canadian history, it's very difficult for mass movements to take place in English Canada. It's Quebec that has a history of mass movements. And to a certain extent, Alberta can also sometimes put together a bit of a mass movement, at least within that one province. But English Canadians generally are suspicious of mass movements politically. We are suspicious of them. And so I have inherited that suspicion. So as much as I was on the one side saying, yes, it's important that we Black men stand up and show our pride in each other and demonstrate our strength and so on, the Canadian part of me refused to be sucked into a mob. This is the English aristocracy versus Yankee mobocracy again, Patrick. Right? You know, whether we like it or not, the fact that we are a monarchy means that we have descended from an aristocratic, hierarchical view of our society. And all of us have imbibed that. All of us have. No matter how much we think of ourselves as being Republicans or Democrats who like the Tim Hortons coffee and watching hockey and so on. And so somehow that makes us unaristocratic and unhierarchical. But the truth of the matter is that we are very hierarchical. Our whole society is organized around hierarchies. The secret word in Canadian politics is status. Many of us never think about that, but the secret word in Canadian social politics is status. The question we are always asked is, what is our status?
Where is here?
Yeah. Status of women, Indigenous people, what's your status? Are you status Indian, non-status Indian, immigrant, status immigrant, non-status immigrant? So Canada is definitely organized as a sub-monarchy of what was the British monarchy, which we still have, although we call it the Canadian monarchy. But once you have a monarchy, you have a hierarchical society. I keep telling people, look you don't think you live in a monarchy? What's that Latin inscription on the coins? What does that say? By the monarch's head, by the sovereign's head. What does that say? Deus ex gratia. What does that mean? I don't know. Decolonization means knowing your history. Decolonization means knowing your history. What that says is, by the grace of God, the Queen. So what you are saying, every single time you spend that toonie or that loonie or that quarter, that dime, that nickel, you're saying, thank you, God, for the Queen. Thank you, God, for the Queen. Now contrast that with the United States. And of course, their Latin inscription, A pluribus unum, one people out of many. And of course, they have their slogan, one nation under God. That's a republic, res publica, the people rule. We don't have that. We have a society where we say one person matters. It's the Queen. And she's been given to us by God, himself, herself, themselves. And so once you have that kind of a political structure, it's top down. And we divide Canadians according to their status, how much status they have. And the status they have is related to how close they come to the monarch. I'll put it very simply. The more you look like the monarch, the more you talk like the monarch, if you follow the monarch's religion, if you have a class that is similar to the monarchs, you have extremely high status in Canada. Extremely high status. In fact, you can be a poor Briton, Briton, poor, holes in your pockets, holes in your shoes, and you're shuffling the streets looking like you're suffering from some kind of addiction or whatever. And as soon as you open up your mouth and you have a British accent, you're going to get first class treatment. Everybody's going to be running to open the door for you because you've got that Windsor Castle accent. And that look, for crying out loud. So I'd like to see some kind of skit on TV where we actually see that happen, because one was just for laughs.
Right.
where you get that kind of treatment. But anyway, to come back to the point of the question and so on, what I'm trying to what I'm trying to get at here is Black Canadians exist within this hierarchical, formulaic structure of our society, which can mean, for instance, that persons coming from the Caribbean may have more status than persons coming from Africa. Right. Persons coming from Africa may have more status than persons who were born and raised in several generations because of class differences. Because if you are especially an immigrant arriving from the African middle class, or for that matter, upper class, you may have higher education and certainly a higher income or more money in the bank than many African Canadians whose roots go back centuries, even to the time of enslavement. And so there isn't really necessarily any automatic agreement. Well, let me put this a different way, as clearly as I can. And I got the biggest difference. One that I still answer this question about American versus Canadian differences.
Of course.
And I'm getting at it this way. African Americans, no matter what their class background, are all united by being this block of African Americans, as I've been saying, with this long-standing history going back 400 years, right? And so regardless of class differences, there's the understanding that they all come from the same place and all have the same struggle, which doesn't mean that there aren't political differences and religious differences and so on. They are there. But when the chips are down, they're all on the same side, and will, in majorities of 90-something%, all vote for the same things. Again, very possible for African Americans to have mass movements of one sort or another. That is less possible for English Canadians, and also less possible for African Canadians. And so I will elaborate upon that right now. The reason for that is, ladies and gentlemen, my brethren and sister Canucks, we live in the world's second largest country that has 5.5 time zones, that has 10 provinces and 3 territories, that has 2 official languages. The effect of all of that segmentation is that there is not one single Canadian identity. If there never was. Exactly. If there is not one single Canadian identity, there is not one single African Canadian identity. And that fact is exacerbated by the fact that we are a multicultural, polyglot, polyphonous peoples, plural. We are the culture of cultures. We are exactly what Joe Clarke, a community of communities, put forward in '79, only to be blasted by Trudeau as saying that Joe Clarke wanted a community of shopping centers. Shame on you, Pierre. Shame. You should never have said that about what is in fact is simply a truth about Canadian society. We are a community of communities. So what that means for Black Canadians is a series of difficulties. So for instance, if I'm an Anglophone in Quebec and I suffer racism at the hands of, for the sake of argument, someone who refuses to rent me a room, an apartment, or a police officer who attempts to arrest me for specious reasons or whatever. And in both cases, the police officer or the landlord are white Quebecois, de souche. How do I have my voice, my complaint heard? Who do I go to? There are Black Quebecois or Black Francophone organizations I might be able to appeal to, and maybe they would help me as a Black Anglophone. But even so, unless they were willing to operate in English with me, there would be that linguistic difficulty. On the other hand, if I'm Black Quebecois and I suffer racism in the Quebec state, can I get on the phone and call the Black agencies in Toronto to drive down Macdonald-Cartier Freeway, the 401, to Montreal and come to my assistance? Can I do that? Would I even think about that? If I'm in Nova Scotia and I've got problems, a Black community feels it has problems with policing, the RCMP, police forces in general around Nova Scotia, can I send an email to folks in Vancouver and say, get on an Air Canada, WestJet, whatever, or get on the train and come to Halifax and stand with us as we struggle for our equality vis-a-vis and liberty and justice vis-a-vis our oppressive racist police force? I can't.
Much more difficult.
I'm not even thinking about it. And even if I did call, would they come? They might send money, which would be very welcome, but it's the world's second largest country. It's expensive. So I'm on my own, or our community is on its own. Nor can we appeal easily to assistance from outside other countries. Can Jamaican Canadians in Montreal call upon the Prime Minister of Jamaica to come to Montreal and speak in their defense against racism from the Sûreté de Québec? And saying, if I'm an Ethiopian in Toronto, can I have the Ethiopian president come to Toronto and wave his or her finger at the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, and say, you are not doing the right thing by our Black Ethiopian people in Toronto? So,
good luck.
Yeah, no matter which way you look at it, because of the fact that Black Canadians come from everywhere, from lots of different periods of time, going back 4 centuries to the 17th century, there isn't an easy unity that we can lay claim to, unlike African Americans. But there's a positive side to this, which means that while Black American culture essentially is the expression of New York and Detroit, Chicago, and LA, and New Orleans, and that, other pockets, largely what we think of as African American culture, letters, and so on, is essentially the product of these major cities. And Boston, I'll add Boston too very quickly. It is, in essence, it is a unitary expression with some regional variation, but essentially a regional expression. But essentially a national expression. James Brown is or was enjoyed everywhere across the U.S. There wasn't a regional barrier to enjoying James Brown's music. In Canada, because of the fact that all Black cultures in Canada are creatures of provinces and then of municipalities and so on, we all have to have very distinct social formations all across the country. And then add to that the fact that we're coming from various ethnicities, various national ethnicities, which means that what we end up with then is not a monolithic culture, and I'm going to describe African America as a monolithic culture for the sake of this discourse. I do perceive African America as being essentially a monolithic culture. African Canadian culture is a kaleidoscopic culture, like Canada itself. If Canada is multicultural, we are extremely multicultural. So that, on the one hand, the negative is that it makes it more difficult for us to act in concert, even when we have concerns that are similar all across the country. The positive side, and I like to focus on this as a writer and as an academic, we have an extremely rich and creative and intriguing and interesting and dynamic culture because of the fact it's not just one thing.
Yep, I absolutely agree with that.
I love that fact, that to be Black in Canada is not even to be Black. You don't have to be, because of the fact that we have all these heritages, which also involve mixed race people, also involve Métis people, also involve Black Indigenous liaisons, so that we have every type of potential Black person on the planet here. And the literature that we create is therefore polyglot, multicultural, bilingual, multilingual, and full of disagreements. If I'm coming from Barbados, like the late Austin Clarke did, and I see myself as aspiring to be establishment, as Austin Clarke did, while also being a ferocious satirist of the Canadian establishment. But he did like his pinstripe suits. He liked the cigars. And he liked that demon alcohol. He liked the demon martinis.
Shame on him.
Gotta be careful about that stuff.
Yeah,
right?
really.
Three olives, always 3 olives. And it was a gin martini, 3 olives, Bombay Sapphire. But stay away from it. Keep away from it. And stay away from the weed too while you're at it.
Of course.
Yeah,
of course.
Avoid all that stuff. Right? But so here's Austin Clarke, who is somebody who was comfortable satirizing the establishment, but also wanting to be part of the establishment as an anti-racist as an anti-racist statement, because for him, if he couldn't wear those pinstripes and smoke that cigar and carry that beautiful briefcase and sit in that private club as a visibly Black man immigrant from Barbados, that meant that white English Canada was having to accept him as an equal.
Right.
And there is a powerful anti-racism message in that statement, even though he's also saying, and not to say that he personally thought this, but some might think that he's saying, oh, well, I don't really want to worry about the working class or the lower classes or whatever. It's just good that I'm part of the elite now.
Right.
Fine. But that would be his attitude inherited in terms of his coming from Barbados, right? Which is Little England, which is what it was called. Although I'm glad that they're kicking out the monarchy, the British.
Finally, yes.
But, it was called Little England, tea at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, no matter how hot it was. On the other hand, if I'm coming from revolutionary Trinidad, I might have a different attitude towards class and power. But if I'm coming from Baptist Church, African Baptist Church, Nova Scotia, I might have a different orientation around issues of class and class formation, and even the idea of struggle. I might have a different idea. So again, these differences make it more difficult for us to be a coherent, cohesive, single community. But the beauty of it is that I get all that great satirization of the upper classes, the establishment in Canada, and of the immigration and immigrants to Canada from Elliott Clarke. And I can get a revolutionary impulse from Dion Brand or from M. Nervesi Phillip. Or I can go to someone like the late George Boyd, unfortunately late, who in his great play Consecrated Ground pits the African Baptist Church in Nova Scotia against the power of social workers and City of Halifax bulldozers in terms of dramatizing the destruction of Africa. Or I can go to Denis Laferrière, L'Enfant Terrible.
Of course.
Denis Laferrière and his comment faire l'amour avec un nègre sans se fatiguer. Right? How to Make Love to a Negro Without Getting Tired.
Yeah.
Stay away from that book. Stay away from it. But anyway, it's a great satire.
It's a great book. Yeah.
It is. And I'm so glad that I have access to it. I can read French, but I'm happy I will read, and I teach the English translation of that great book. Larry Hill, coming from Ontario, but also partly African American in his background. But he's a guy who worked for the Ontario government. And so therefore he is privy to, and someone who wrote for the Globe and Mail. So he's privy to establishment Canada, English Canada, but also given his own father being a director of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, has great knowledge of Ontario Black history and the struggle for liberty and equality and justice for Black people in Ontario and Black people in Canada. So he brings a very distinctive voice to the table. Andre Alexis is born in Trinidad, but he also has Haitian heritage through his father, but he went to Canterbury Arts High School, and he was raised in Petrolia, Ontario.
Of all places, yeah.
If you read Andre and you think you're seeing some surrealism going on, blame it on Petroleum. Just blame it on that, right? So, and that's what I just say. Look, folks, if you want to understand him, understand the fact he's an extremely brainy African-Canadian writer who troubles the identity itself of African-Canadian all the time, and I'm glad he does it. But he finds his stories kind of ironic and satiric and mythical and so on. He's from Petroleum.
Yeah.
What do you want?
So not to cut you off, but like this is just because we're coming up on 2 hours here almost of talking, and very interesting stuff, but I don't want to take too much of your time either. I'm sure you're very busy. I do want to talk about, because you've been kind of alluding to this, and I feel like it's a good place to plug this question, right? You've been talking about the way that various writers in Canada have incorporated their own backgrounds and their own histories. And I'm curious about how that works in your work in particular. And I'm thinking of your publications like Execution Poems or Whyla Falls that have done that. And I have an excerpt here from Execution Poems, specifically a poem called The Killing, which I think kind of sums this up in a very interesting way. And I'd be curious to kind of hear you talk more about how history is channeled through your work. And so this is a part of the poem in which the two main characters have just murdered someone, right? And this is the interaction that they have. Geo, can we cover up a murder with snow, with white frosty roses? Rue, here's how I justify my error. The blow that slew Silver came from 2 centuries back. It took that much time and agony to turn a white man's whip into a black man's hammer. Geo, no, we needed money. So you hit the so-and-so, only much too hard. Now what? Rue, so what? And I thought, like, reading that passage when I read Execution Poems was just such an impactful moment for me. Like, I understood, well, yeah, I didn't necessarily understand, but I saw this channeling of history that I thought was very interesting and potent. And I was curious to hear you talk more about how that operates in your work in general.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for reading that segment. And so, okay, I know we gotta sum up here. So I'll say it once again: decolonizing your mind means knowing your history.
There you go.
And so I was 34 when my mom blurted out to me that I had two cousins who were hanged, George Rufus Hamilton, who were hanged for murder of a taxi driver and the robbing of the same gentleman in Fredericton, New Brunswick in 1949. So I was 34 years old before I heard about this family tragedy, because it was. But I also knew immediately I would write something about it because I wanted to reflect on my parents' experiences growing up as Black people in Nova Scotia. And I also wanted to reflect on my own tensions and stresses as a young Black man. I would never have resorted to violence or criminality in any way, shape, form, just being the person I am. On the other hand, did I feel anger? Did I feel rage? Did I feel upset? Yes. And I managed to channel that into artistic activities and political activism as well, and so on. But I also had to think, there but for the grace of God go I, or would have gone I, if not for my first cousins once removed, my second cousins, George Rufus Hamilton, who were from the same place my mother was from, 3 Mile Plains, Newport Station, Nova Scotia, where I still own land. So to shorten my answer, knowing that I was going to write a book of poems, and which eventually, and also a novel about the same story, George and Rue, I knew I had to saturate myself with the history of that era. And I did that by going to Fredericton, visiting the prison where they were held, which is now a science museum, but especially reading through the Daily Gleaner, the Fredericton Daily Gleaner, every single paper, every single day, from early January 1949 to a day or two after the guys were executed, July 27, 1949. And soaking up the society, which is reflected in the pages of the newspaper, as well as reading other people's accounts of the crimes and so on, but also setting it in a larger context of the Cold War, World War II. George claimed to have been a merchant marine sailor under a pseudonym, so it's never been established that he actually was there as a service person during the war. It is established that he went AWOL from the Army, and he says he went AWOL from the Army because they were calling him the N-word and were making him peel potatoes and clean the latrine. And he said, enough. But he still served his country, if we accept his argument, by joining the Merchant Marine under a pseudonym. And I want to think about Rufus and the fact that he was the career criminal more than George was. George was an accidental criminal. He would steal when he was hungry, steal for that kind of reason. But Rue was a violent guy. He was a guy who was all wound up, very angry, and so prone to do violent crime. But I still wanted to understand the world that they came from. And so that meant understanding European colonization of the so-called New World, the attitudes that led to apartheid in South Africa, segregation in the Americas, exploitation of Black labor everywhere, including in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and the failure to provide adequate education, deliberate failure to provide adequate education for Black people, the social mores that quietly, tacitly, politely accepted that it was okay to practice anti-Semitism, practice racism, practice sexism, practice homophobia, of course, and on and on and on, right? The fact that we had societies that were completely split also by Protestant versus Catholic religious differences.
Of course.
Just to name that as well, let alone all of the other kind of racial and ethnic splits, and understand how that was expressed through the legal system, through the education system, through employment or non-employment, and reflect on all of that. So yeah, that line about the hammer coming from 2 centuries back is expressed is actually a reflection of an idea that's become more and more common now, which is talk about post-traumatic slavery disorder. The idea that simple emancipation or the abolition of slavery didn't necessarily end all the negative concepts that Black people imbibe, self-hatred that our ancestors imbibed, and for that matter, attitudes of white supremacy that were also imbibed and continued to be communicated for decades and centuries after, in the same way that notions of Black inferiority were imbibed and communicated down through generations and so on after. I remember my own mother, lovingly, and who I loved and love still, she's gone and has been for 22 years, but she would refer to my brothers and I as pickaninnies, which was actually a slave term, right, to refer to Black kids picking cotton. So she meant it in a kindly, loving way, and I didn't mind it as a boy. It's my mom, so it's okay. At the same time, it's actually, of course, learned behavior reinforced by white racism. That's how you can consider black kids or black children can be that, or to also in gentle ways think about someone being a gingerbread boy, and so on. And again, it's actually the image is kind of nice. I like gingerbread dudes, no problem.
Sure.
But it's understanding the history even of popular culture that allows one to begin to think about and to forensically explore the impact of these kinds of deleterious imaginings, negative conceptions of peoples, and how that gets played out in public policy, and so on. And of course, the response of disaffected communities, of disparaged and marginalized communities. So I came across a mention by Peter Gazowski in Maclean's magazine, 1963, talking about the lynching of an Indigenous man, which is what it was, the lynching of an Indigenous man in Saskatchewan, 1963. The man was lynched by 9 worthies, 9 prominent citizens of Regina, lynched this guy. And apparently there wasn't much reaction from the RCMP or anybody. It's like, oh, just another dead Indian, in quotation marks.
Yeah.
So how does that happen? How do we get to those kinds of attitudes? Well, it's through historical processes and political processes that insist on ranking some people as being better than others, as deserving more benefits than others from the society. And we still have that struggle in Canada. We still have that struggle to create a truly just and egalitarian society. And in order to get there, we're going to have to overthrow the idea that Canada is, quote, a white man's country, unquote. We need to remember that it never was, given the presence of Indigenous people. It never was. And it isn't now, given the fact that we are a multicultural society, multicultural, multiracial, and for that matter, multi-faith. And the more we can accept that this is Canada, what it really is, and what it always was, and what it always wanted to be, and what it is in the act of becoming, then we will achieve what we need to achieve.
Absolutely. Excellent. Thank you for that answer. Mac, did you want to go? I think we'll start to wind down here, but did you want to go with your last big question?
Sure, why not? So this is something you've already talked about this, touched on it a bit earlier, like near the beginning when you were sort of talking about the history of the Métis people. But so you recently wrote about Afro-Métis intersections. So can you sort of tell us what sort of got you started on that process? Like what was the sort of impetus to be like, oh, I want to talk about this? And then where do you see that discussion going?
Oh, great question. And I'll try to be succinct again. So here we go. A couple of years ago, I made it known publicly that I am part Indigenous, and I put out a CD with a few other people, which is called Constitution, and it's by the Afro-Métis Nation. And there are 5 of us who put together this CD. Great music, by the way. And there's a reaction from some Indigenous people who made it known to me that this was a great problem that we were accessing this term Métis, because there is really only one Métis Nation in Canada.
Okay.
And it's essentially prairie-based with offshoots in Ontario and offshoots in British Columbia. And I had a lot of pushback from people saying, you can't use that term, and real Métis people are going to be upset with you, and other Indigenous people are going to be upset with you. Why don't you just call yourself Black Native or Black Indigenous and leave it at that, and everybody will be sort of okay. And then there were people actually called me a tribal wannabe, and so I really got very hostile about the idea that I could even claim to have any kind of Indigenous heritage. And so, frankly, that's what pushed me to look into it. And the first thing that shocked me was the Government of Canada's official definition of Métis. Shocked me when I first read it. I hadn't read it until 2020. When I read it, I was blown away because it's so simple, so elegantly simple, and so incorrect.
Yeah.
It basically says, look, the Métis people are people who were involved in the fur trade between basically Ontario and British Columbia, but especially in the prairie provinces, around the prairie provinces, and resulted from unions, marriages is the word used in the official definition, between Scottish and French voyageurs and Indigenous women, but only in this very precise geographic area, which is actually quite immense, the former Northwest Territories. and were involved in the fur trade. So, and on the surface, that seems right. Yeah, well, Louis Riel comes to mind, and we think, yes, that seems to make perfect sense. Until you start to look at it, dig out the history just a tiny bit, and I sort of remembered that the fur trade was basically, wasn't it anchored in Montreal?
Yep.
So, is it possible that there were Quebecois, people would now call Quebecois, Montrealais, who were fur traders, who also conducted a fur trade through Quebec into Ontario, maybe Manitoba, but also through Quebec and Ontario down through the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi River to Louisiana, back and forth. Were they fur traders or not? Well, according to histories of Louisiana and the fur trade, they were fur traders. According to the Empire of the St. Lawrence, one of the great historical economic by Donald Creighton, one of the great economic histories of Canada, they were fur traders, and the fur trade built Canada, and it was anchored in Montreal, for crying out loud. So that began to cause some problems just in the geographical sense of things. Then I came across a paper written by, I think, a maritimer that specifically looks at the interactions between Acadians and Mi'kmaq, and which puts forward with facts and figures intermarriage between these francophones and indigenous people, Acadians and Mi'kmaq, their involvement in fur trade and fisheries throughout Atlantic Canada.
Right.
And so then I'm thinking, well, you've got Atlantic Canada seems to have a Métis population, according to the way the government of Canada defines Métis. Quebec certainly has a Métis population because we know that the French men who had slave women had children by them, were involved in the fur trade as well, had children by black women as well. It's in the history. And so is it really possible to rule out Quebecois as being fur traders? And then what about the black men who paddled those canoes? We know that they had relations with indigenous women, hopefully consensual, and they had children. So do they count, or did you have to be European, specifically white French, white Scottish? What if you were black French? What if you were black Scottish? Do you still count as Métis? So the more I looked at this definition, and even the economic side of it, what about the slave trade? Is a white Frenchman involved with an indigenous woman as his slave? Does he father a Métis child, or does he father a mulatto child? Somebody help me. Because according to the government of Canada, that child is probably a Métis child.
Right.
Right.
So there's a sense of like recontextualizing then that's happening with this project, right?
Yeah. And just exposing the fact that, and this is a big problem. This is the hugest problem. So thank you, Patrick and Mackenzie, for getting me to this. The biggest problem with this whole discourse, which is, and I will say immediately, I do not deny the existence of a distinct, special, specific Métis people. I do not. I recognize that they exist. I am proud of their existence. My difference is with the idea that there's only one Métis nation. There's only one Métis people. I do take issue with that. I think that as soon as you create a nation, you create minorities. As soon as you create a nation, you create minorities. There are always going to be minorities in whatever nation you ever want to put together. There are going to be minority constituents of that nation. So if there is a Métis nation writ large, there are smaller minority Métis nations that may not look anything like the official Métis nation. Just as a minority group in Canada, as a minority group, may not look anything like the majority of Canadians. Right. But that doesn't stop them from being Canadian, and doesn't stop them from being their minority selves, right? But it does make them a minority within the larger, within the mass. So it's a very simple concept. But I would say to my Indigenous and Métis brethren and sistren that you need to be very careful about accepting a government of Canada definition about who can be Métis and who is not Métis, when that very same government was telling you that you could not be Indigenous, that you could not be Indian, that you had to be assimilated into European Christian attitudes and ways. So if you now can rightly say that you oppose that and understand that to be cultural genocide, why will you accept the current government of Canada practicing another form of cultural genocide by saying that only these people constitute a Métis nation? And we are going to disallow people in Quebec and people in Atlantic Canada from claiming any kind of Métis heritage, even if the same processes that created the major Métis nation based in the prairies or on the prairies also created Métis nations plural elsewhere in Canada. And to deny that is again another form of cultural genocide. And I will thank Pope Francis for giving me permission to use that term. Thank you. I'll also just say that the government of Canada has a very poor record when it comes comes to recognizing various ethnicities as being Canadian.
Yep.
I'm laughing, but the history is grievous. The history is grievous and ugly. And so they're the last entity that should be running around trying to tell anybody, well, you can be Indigenous, you can be Métis, but you can't be. No. You don't. You got away with it too long. Just last year, 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada said the Sinixt Nation, which had been ruled extinct by Ottawa, Ottawa came along and said in the 1950s to the Sinixt people, thou art extinct. Boom.
Yep.
And then the Sinixt people said, no, we're not.
Hello, we're here.
Oh, how's it going?
And they struggled for decades until finally our case made its way to the Supreme Court last year, April 2021, where the Supreme Court said, guess what? The Sinixt people were not ever extinct.
Yeah.
And now they're going to have to make sure they get their lands back and hunting rights and fishing rights and so on, blah, 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 that you unilaterally extinguished. And by the way, you got to pay some money.
Of course.
Because you gave away their land to people who were not supposed to have it, should never have had it. So there's going to have to be some millions of dollars in settlement. So I would say, given the track record of Le Gouvernement du Canada, given that track record, as an Indigenous person myself, I would say to other Indigenous people, you should be very careful before you start signing on to Government of Canada dicta about who can be what and where they can be and so on, because their record is horrible. It's genocidal. Thank you, Pope Francis. Don't blame me. Blame Pope Francis. He said it. He said it too. So I'm going to follow him. I'm going to accept him as my spiritual leader right now and say that I'm just following what he said. Yeah. Don't get mad at me. Get mad at him. I'm his disciple right now, today, right now, just for 5 minutes. I'm his disciple.
Exactly. But you do point, I think, to a very interesting idea of the issue of making multiculturalism a policy. Not that the idea isn't good. Like, the idea of having a pluralistic society of communities is very good, but then you enter into a whole issue of like, how do you define these societies once you make it a policy, right? So I think you very much hit on that point, and it directly addresses the question, right? What is the importance of talking about Afro-Métis literatures or intersections, right? It's still a debate today, right? And the very fact that we acknowledge the existence of these intersections and literatures is vital to the theme, I think, of this whole discussion, decolonizing ourselves in many ways.
Yeah, I think, Patrick and Mackenzie, as we end up, and I thank you for your patience with my rambling speakers and so on, but here's the thing. Look, the Canadian people are a very great and charitable people. We have, as a whole, in our history, have generally, the people, not governments, the people have, I think, generally tried to do the right things, even if they have been blinkered by various ideologies and religion. But I think the people, by and large, have tried to find ways to live together and live with each other in something like congeniality and harmony and so on, despite governments doing their best to split everybody up. And I think we should always adhere to that. So when people might say to me, well, how then would you define who's Métis and who isn't? How do you define who's Black and who isn't? So you can't. Yeah. You can't define that. So try and define it to say, it's like this much blood and that much land territory. Then you get into South African apartheid style. You can't do it. Unfortunately, or actually, let me put it this way, fortunately for us all, when the Creator created humanity, they made it possible for human beings to mix and mingle, creating lots of different peoples. And guess what? We're still mixing and mingling and creating lots of different people, lots of different
Who knew?
So on.
Damn.
So to try to say you better stop, boom, and be only this and be only that, you gotta put forward fascism. That's the only way to do it. And even then, there's going to be a lot of people who slip through, who mask and masquerade. And then what happens to your fascist state that you've been trying so hard to put together, right? So I say no. It's the people working together, living together, dreaming together, loving together, decide who they are, not governments.
Absolutely. So as we wind down, I do think it is important because, while we've talked more about history in this case and general cultural politics, I do think it is important to highlight the fact that you are obviously a poet as well as an academic. And I'm just curious, and you can tell our audience about it. Are you working on particular poetic projects currently? What are they? Would you like to say anything about that? just to whet our audience's appetite, if you will.
Okay, I'm going to try to be as brief as I can here.
Probably you're working on a million things at this point.
Yeah, right now, today, I've got to get back to editing what's going to be volume 5 of what will ultimately be a 6-part, God willing, what will ultimately be a 6-part epic poem.
Oh, wow.
But volume 5, which is already 420 pages, is about the formation of the African Baptist Church in Nova Scotia, but based on historical processes and invented personalities, as well as some historical actors and so on. That's to be published in November. I'm also editing the memoir autobiography of Howard Douglas McCurdy, Canada's first Black tenured professor, biology, University of Windsor, 1959, and second Black member of Parliament, and the only Black member of Parliament from 1984 to 1993 during his 2 terms. Founder of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, the founder of the Canadian Society of Microbiologists, the founder of the Canadian College of Microbiologists, and leader of the civil rights movement, which again I'll put in quotation marks, in Essex County, Windsor, Chatham, Dresden, London, Amherstburg, 1950s, 1960s, founder of the National Black Coalition of Canada, NBCC, just a personality. I'm enjoying working through his autobiography and editing it, and it's going to come out with Nimbus of Halifax next year. I also published last year 2 books of poetry. My 5th coloring book, which is called White, which is a general collection of poetry from Gaspereau Press. And I published J'accuse, Poem versus Silence, which is my rebuke of cancel culture, and specifically the attempt of cancel culture to blacklist me. I use that verb deliberately, and the collusion of some journalists to go along with that, and in fact to sensationalize a particular issue that should never have been sensationalized in order to create news about something that was grievous but certainly not newsworthy. But I felt it was important, since no one had the courage to allow me to speak back openly to those who wanted to see me defamed and maligned forever and forever and forever. I realized that the only way I could answer back effectively was through poetry. So there haven't been that many reviews of J'accuse, but all the reviews that have been out so far, and I know of a couple that are in the works, have been very good.
I'll give you one right now. I really enjoyed it. It was
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, I'm proud of that book. I'm sorry for what occasioned it, which was basically being publicly shamed and defamed in 2020, and needing to recuperate the truth about what had happened in that instance. And so I was driven back to history again, to Zola and his famous letter against the president of the French Republic in 1892 over the Dreyfus affair, and also thinking of other J'accuses over the years, especially Julian Benda's version of J'accuse, La Trahison des Clercs, Treason of the Intellectuals, published in 1928 in French, 1935 in English. Pierre Elliott Trudeau came up with his New Treason of the Intellectuals, 1962, following Benda, without giving Benda credit. Shame on you, PET, shame.
Another theme running throughout this episode, shame on Trudeau.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, but I got to say that federalism and the French Canadians, in fact, in that essay, New Treason and Intellectuals, he puts forward that idea to problematize the idea of Quebec nationalism, that every nation has minorities. And the real test of a nation is how it treats its minorities. What kinds of liberties and egalitarian behaviors are actually going to be practiced, as opposed to marginalizing, delegitimatizing behaviors and laws and so on. And so he posits the problem for Quebec nationalists circa 1962. What are you going to do about Indigenous people? What are you going to do about other European ethnicities and minorities, religious minorities as well, within your perfect state? And do you really need to have your own state? Why can't you be an effective province within Canada, given all of the tools that the BNA Act gives you to govern yourself as a province within the larger framework of Canada?
Right.
And so I can take issue with lots of aspects of Pierre Trudeau's thought, and it was thought. I mean, anybody who doubts that, just pick up even just the English translation of his approaches to politics for 1970, or his with Jacques Hébert, Two Innocents in Red China, Deux Hommes en Chien Rouge, oh, for crying out loud, where he's sitting down with Mao, doing somersaults and so on. He's walking along with his red guards, the Chinese red guards. He'll walk along and then he does a somersault. They don't react. Right. They don't react. They don't notice this fool doing foolish things.
It is an entertaining read in many ways.
It is. I especially think of Macintosh.
Right.
He shows up a couple times in that text. But anyway, it's the great problem that he puts forward is exactly the answer that federalism creates, which is you give everybody their own space within the larger framework. And you do not oppress minorities. You do not oppress minorities. You accept minorities and with complete equality. And we can see the results of the statist thinking of some Quebecois nationalists by looking at some of the laws that have been put forward by right-leaning governments recently. And I know about the arguments about it's only about secularism, blah, blah, blah. Well, look, you know what? I doubt that any faith is going to dissolve the constitutional framework of Quebec anytime soon. I doubt it. Somehow.
Same here. Again, that's a whole other topic of discussion that we can go into. But
just get a life. No one's asking you to put on anything or take off anything for that matter. Live your life.
Before we end this officially, there's always one question that we like to ask people that we interview, and that is, what didn't we ask? And what's the one question that you would have really liked to talk about and didn't get a chance to? And then, I'm sorry, audience, if this is too long for you, but I'm finding you very fascinating to listen to. So, I'm not going to apologize for a 2-hour episode.
Thank you so very, very much once again. The one question you didn't ask me was, will you read something for us?
Of course.
Oh, yes.
And so I am going to read something. I want to.
God, how did we miss that one? Now that I'm looking back on it, we've got a former poet laureate held captive right now. We didn't ask him to read poetry. And this is a strange book. I admit immediately it's a strange book because it was written out of my juvenilia. The first writing I did as a teenager, and I didn't burn it like you're supposed to. I went back and reread it when I was 44, and I cringed. And I thought, oh my golly, how could I have written that or thought that as a 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old, and so on. But I also saw a lot of stuff that was good, and I started to put it together, and that resulted in this novel as poetry, I, published by Goose Lane Editions, still very much in print, first published in 2009. So I'm going to read this section about Betty, who's 18, meeting Malcolm, who's 18. They're both seniors in high school in Halifax. The year and month is April 1974, and they are falling in love. April opens with clustered, lustrous snow and a million blasts of rain. Plucky springs upsurge through muck until tiny, fragile flowers blare rainbow trumpets rousing up grass. In the public gardens, where she's often cantered past on horseback, Betty watches geese besiege the clean park, Parliament, the clear pond, while on its fringes pigeons waddle, overfed despite prohibitive signs. Though this April remains unheated, sunshine gilds the gardens. Human music intrudes and Betty twirls about, ogles and Orpheus, pertinent in his whistling, like marbles. The notes roll, sparkle in undulant air. Malcolm seesaws as he strides like a rodeo dude or a Jack Tar, a sailor. Betty recalls they both took English last year when Malcolm would recite comic books in class, spurning the paperbacks of classic verse, a schoolboy's rebel act. Here he's slick, a down-home East Coast soul man, and a prize fighter, black leather come to life. In the sports news, Betty's seen
him dance erect, slender, pretty, while cornered fools drop. On television, he shows off svelte power, flashing that onyx patina, prancing on boxer wiry legs, jabbing, dabbing, and bouncing. Up close, Malcolm looks a glistening black stallion. All her thoughts of him slant into italics. I think I'll stop there, and thank you all so much for your patience. I loved it.
I loved it too. And listeners who might not be aware, we had planned more questions, but I feel like as you were talking, you kind of answered other questions that we had already planned. So honestly, we may not have felt like we were asking a lot of questions, but Professor Clarke certainly answered a lot of them that even if we didn't
anticipated them already. Yes.
It's
preemptive strike.
It's almost like we had sent him the questions beforehand.
You did, and I read them.
There you go.
And they're very good.
Thank you. But honestly, thank you very much, not only for the excellent answers, but for joining us, for giving us so much of your time, and for the lovely reading of a novel that sounds like poetry when you read it, which I think all the more demonstrates your capacities as a writer and your brilliance as an author.
Stop! But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming here. It was quite the honor, honestly.
Absolutely.